while we're going to be talking about statistics and trends, I do want to acknowledge the incident that happened overnight and be mindful of the fact that this involved a real person who lost his life. It involved officers who were put in a position to make a decision to use deadly force, and we know that this affects every officer who is put in that position and will affect their lives, going forward, and families and untold others. So, I don't want that to get lost in the discussion about statistics, and Chief will talk a little bit about his experiences and reinforce that. And with that, I'm just going to have Chief talk a little bit about the incident, just a little bit of an update, and then we'll get into the slide presentation.
As we go through the presentation today, and we offer raw statistics and data as it's related to a lot of different groups and individuals that were involved in these incidents, I think it's important that we kind of look at what we're seeing as a community and a trend. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about and that we could quickly identify with over the past 5 years is we have 3 principal areas where officer-involved shootings are occurring. And the first one is being the attempt to apprehend a violent criminal. We have seen this, had a shooting earlier this year off of Wyoming and Osuna, where officers attempting to take an armed robbery suspect into custody. We had a violent criminal who had stolen a bait car, who fired out of the back of a bait car. So we have those types of officer-involved shootings that are directly involved in apprehending some of the most violent, dangerous people in the city of Albuquerque. We also have another subgroup of incidents where individuals are suffering some kind of mental health episode and who are going through some kinds of issues. We have, as we term them, suicide by cop, and we've had several of these incidents through the past several years, and it looks like, this year it looks like we even see possibly an increase in that. And the third area is, we have, individuals who sometimes have very little criminal record, but they're under the influence of some kind of intoxicating drug or alcohol, and they make poor decisions. And we've talked about that recently. It is not responsible to be in possession of a firearm as you're intoxicated. And a lot of bad things are going to happen, especially if you decide to handle that firearm in the presence of officers without communication. So last night's incident fits that category all over again. It's an individual who the Valley Area Command had been dealing with. They've actually arrested the individual 3 times in the past 3 months. They're working with our crisis intervention unit to get this individual the help they need. He was released from court, we think somewhere around November 3rd. There was an episode at a local bank yesterday where this individual broke a window, started yesterday about 9 o'clock in the morning. From that broken window, it proceeded to officers are looking for this individual during the course of the day. During that interaction where he was frustrated because he couldn't use his ATM card, he did threaten individuals at the bank who had called police. We fast forward a little bit over 12 hours, and this individual ends up outside of the prisoner transport unit. He'd actually been criminal trespassed for causing disturbances at the prisoner transport unit in the past, and the prisoner transport unit asks for uniformed officers to address and to talk to this individual. They're already looking for him and had charges from earlier in the day. The individual then fled officers across the street, and we come up with a situation that I think is very problematic for our officers. We end up with 4 officers, a supervisor, well within what we're being asked to do under our settlement agreement, 2 less lethal, 2 lethal, and a supervisor to supervise the scene. And they're trying to negotiate with this individual at 2 o'clock in the morning on the side of a building downtown, and the individual lunges at officers. Officers discharged their firearm and less lethal, and the individual died as a result of the gunshot wounds he sustained. The officers, of course, will be put on standard leave, and we will be investigating this through a multi-agency task force. And we remind the public that we have a DOJ-approved process. Yesterday, our monitor's report came out, highest rating we've had in compliance since the beginning of this process once again, and that officers do have a due process, and in order for us to hold people accountable, we have to let the due process take its course, the case be investigated internally, and then the results will either determine what was in policy or not out of policy, what actions need to be taken. So yesterday's shooting is just a grim reminder that we need to work with our state legislator, we need to work with our partners in the criminal justice system. We have to find answers. We have to find answers as to how we can reduce the number of contacts with these individuals, and when we do have them in a secure facility like a detention center, how we get them to resources and make sure that they're getting everything they need rather than us trying to deal with them 2 in the morning outside of the downtown police station. So this case is still under review and will continue to be under review, and throughout this we'll be plugging in these 3 areas of concern and talking about how we can work as a community. The reason we're doing this today is I was here in 2014, and I firsthand saw what strain between the community and the police department brought. A lot of that strain was revolving around officer-involved shootings, and we're going to be upfront, transparent, and honest with what the true statistics are, what we are seeing, and educate the community as much as possible to ensure that they have an understanding of what we have in process, how far we've come under our DOJ process, and in some cases that we have had to hold officers accountable, and they were appropriately dealt with, and we continue to want to move forward working with the community on these issues. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Gilbert, and he's going to go through some of the issues that we're seeing and some of the statistics that we've developed.
Thank you, Chief. So we have this slide up here that we put together yesterday just with some recent headlines around the nation. And I want to remind you that probably the beginning of this year, maybe January, February, Chief predicted we were probably going to see more officer-involved shootings based on conversations with chiefs from around the country. And they were seeing upticks everywhere else. So, same with homicides and a lot of the violent crime trends. We have in fact seen a lot more officer-involved shootings. So, and we were just at the conference in Dallas and talked about all these different things: the overdoses, the gun crimes, the suicides by guns, homicides, officer-involved shootings, and the big thing in Dallas was the shooting at officers and officers getting shot. I think we had 2 chiefs who had to leave the conference early because they had officers who got shot in their jurisdiction. So it was heavy on the minds of everyone at that conference, and I just want to kind of bring that up, that this isn't just happening here. We just learned this morning that today's OIS is the 50th in New Mexico, is what state police told us this morning. So it's not even just Albuquerque, it's happening all around the state for a variety of reasons. So with that, I'll just kind of get going with the presentation. Obviously this is dated by a couple of days. So we've had 53 officer-involved shootings from 2018 to currently, and that actually goes up to 54 if you count last night's. So that's over 5 years. Of those, 29 were fatal, 24 were non-fatal. 85% of and I'm going to refer to the OIS, the individuals, as subjects. They're not an offender, they're not a victim necessarily, but I'm going to refer to them as subjects. 85% of them had a firearm or an apparent firearm. And what I mean by that is, in some cases, they had a BB gun or an airsoft gun, but it was made to look like a gun. And then 67% of those fired their gun either prior or during the incident with officers. Another interesting statistic is there were 83 officers involved in those 53 incidents, and 75% had no prior officer-involved shootings. So these are just a couple of graphs splitting that up, and you can see it by year 2018 through 2022, and obviously this year we shot up, and now it should be 17 and 10 fatal OISs. And this just breaks up. If you take the non-fatal ones, you can see which ones involved injuries where a person was shot, and those where there were no injuries at all and nobody was shot, but we still investigate that as an officer-involved shooting. Looking at, is the next one the area command? Yeah. Looking at by area command, we were just talking about this before. This is one of the interesting ones in that, so I have 0 for the Southwest Area Command. Chief just proved me wrong. He said there was one and he remembered it, so I'll have to dig that out and change that. But it's interesting because as opposed to homicides, which are primarily in 3 area commands, I would say Southeast, Valley, and Southwest, and then you'll get some in different other area commands. these are pretty spread apart. And then they're kind of different by year. This year we've had half of our officer-involved shootings have been in the foothills. With that big number, most of them, half have been in the foothills. So it's, I can't really explain it. I don't know if the chief has any thoughts about it. But it's, I think it's just the different situations officers are put in with individuals. It isn't necessarily an area where like a drug crime is being committed, or or what you might have in the southeast or some of the other areas, but they are spread out a little more around the city.
One of the things I would characterize with the increase in the foothills is, if you look at our foothills shootings and you think about them in the past, several of them have been, an individual going through a mental health crisis. We had the individual off of Tramway who was actually a murder suspect that was obviously going through some kind of mental health crisis, ended up killing and shooting some other individuals, and ended up losing their life during the officer-involved shooting. We know we had one off of Central where the individual was pretending to have a gun, giving every indication that they were armed with a firearm. So this year, it seems like there is an increase in those mental health type of cases, and it seems to be centering a lot of it is around the foothills and the cases that we've had up there. Also had another individual who had a simple warrant for DWI out of Colorado who ended up committing suicide, but at the same time we had discharged firearms on that scene, and that's another one of those cases where we believe the individual was, number one, possibly under the influence of alcohol, and number two, suffering some kind of mental health condition.
And some of them have been in the hotel areas like Central and Tramway, and that might be related to auto theft. I think there's one or two of them, and maybe some drug activity in those areas, but that is an area as well. And so here's just a comparison to homicides during the same 5-year period. So just what I was just saying. So the Southeast is obviously the biggest, almost by twice as much as any other area command. That's how they kind of break out. On this next slide, just kind of builds on what I said earlier, is the type of weapon used that the subject had with them. 85%, as I said previously, had a firearm with them, or a BB gun or airsoft. And then we did have a couple instances with a knife, one with a shovel, one recently with some rocks thrown at officers, and I think maybe 2 instances where there was no weapon discovered. I think one of them they had a phone. You remember the other one? The other one, he had the key fob, is what he lifted up his hand. Obviously last night was with a knife, so that was another one, but those are pretty rare occurrences.
I think the most important thing to remember is the vast majority of our incidents, and if you could go back one, I think each incident accounts for about 2%. So when you're looking at this and you're looking at firearms, you're looking at about, the vast majority were armed with a firearm, and I think that's very explainable to the public as to why some of these could have rolled out the way they did. But when you look at the next biggest category, it's knife. And then you look at the next biggest category, it's the 2 incidents Gilbert just talked about. But there's very few incidents in which an individual wasn't armed with a gun or a knife during this period where we had officer-involved shootings. And I think that's important for the community to understand, and for us to continue to work, is like, I don't want there to be this perception that officers are out there just being involved in excessive force when they don't have to. The data is showing our officers are encountering more and more armed subjects on a daily basis. We reduced crime stats yesterday. The category that went up, firearm violations. So there is an abundance of firearms in the community, and we do have these firearms that are leading to these incidents where we're having officer-involved shootings. And I think it's directly impacted also our homicides.
Yeah, that does track. Even with the increase in homicides, the percentage of those involving guns has gone up from like 70% to 80%, and for a while of this year was up to 90%. I think it's dropped down to maybe 85%. So just the firearm involved in homicides and these crimes continues to go up. Next slide, just a little bit more about the guns. So we said 85% had firearms. 30 of those 45% fired those firearms, and then 14 did not fire any. So this is a look at drugs and alcohol and their involvement with officer-involved shootings. I don't know if any of you were here. A couple years ago we had a press conference looking specifically at meth and its involvement with officer-involved shootings. I think Mr. Cox, was he the special prosecutor who reviews a lot of officer-involved shootings, did a study the last decade finding that as much as 80% of officer-involved shootings, the subject had meth in their system, looking at the autopsy reports. We looked at them further and we're finding the same things kind of going up. The one thing with the toxicology reports take so long to get through that it takes a while to find this out, but we continue to see this trend over and over. So if you look at the types of drugs and alcohol, out of the 53 OIS incidents, 18 use drugs, 12 use alcohol, 2 no drugs or alcohol, and then 22 are unknown. And it's unknown either because it's still under investigation or we don't have toxicology reports back, or the vast majority of those who were not injured or did not die, we're probably never going to know whether they were using drugs or alcohol or nothing at all.
You know, I think this is important to note, like, we talked about this, that, you know, each shooting equals about 2% of what's up here. So we're looking at this, and when we're talking about 53 total OISs, we have a portion, about 21 that we don't know, or we don't have information. But there are only 2 officer-involved shootings that we know of, that the individual was not under the influence of some kind of drug or alcohol. And that's key, and it is key to understanding that people are making irrational decisions and our officers are having to deal with it because they're under the influence. And it's sometimes very hard for individuals, especially the families, because we know that there's a grieving family left behind, but so many times it's hard for them to comprehend, why did our loved one do this? And I just want them to just kind of remember that, you know, maybe their loved one wasn't under the right frame of mind. We've all been around intoxicated people who are on drugs, and their reasoning and their thought process is not what it needs to be. That's why we have laws about not driving while you're under these influences. So as difficult as we know it is, and as much as families suffer, I think there could be a little bit of reassurance to them knowing that, you know, your loved one may have not made the best decision based off of the state that they were under, and we're only showing 2 right now where they weren't under some kind of influence.
So this is a look just at the toxicology reports, those that we have. So out of 28 fatal shootings, we have a total of 19 toxicology reports, and as he was saying, 17 showed alcohol or drugs, and 2 showed no alcohol or drugs. The next slide just gets into a little bit more. So 16 cases with meth in their system, 13 with alcohol. Then it goes down. You know, some with marijuana, cocaine, amphetamine. One of the interesting things is fentanyl. Since fentanyl has kind of come into the community over the last couple of years, and we're seeing it so often in a variety of ways. You know, I thought we might see it more in some of these cases, but either it just hasn't reached that point. So since we don't have toxicology reports for this past year, or I don't know. I don't know if it has the same effects. We had doctors and we had our CIT folks talk to us about the effects of meth and how paranoid people tend to be on meth and they think someone's after them anyway, you know, prior to something like this. But I'm not sure if fentanyl, I think it has a similar effect, but I'm not really an expert on that. So we'll see in the coming year what this year's toxicology reports show. And this is just a look at OS by day of the week. It's just, I don't know if it's interesting or not, but Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, what was yesterday? It was a Wednesday, so our Wednesday will go up.
I still find it shocking. Fridays are one of our busiest days in patrolling in the field. That's one of our lowest days of the week.
Yeah. And same by time of day, so that's pretty evenly spread out. I'm kind of shocked that most of them happen in the afternoon. It seems to us like they happen overnight, just because we have to get up and go overnight. But yeah, I don't know if there's any rhyme or reason for that. So these next slides are going to go over the race and ethnicity of. We're going to look at the subjects involved in these OISs as well as the officers. And you'll see in the next slide, I think that they're compared to. I tried comparing them to homicide, both offenders and victims. And they're different. I think victims are a little more like an OIS subject, if you look at there. So 57% are Hispanic, 26% white, 7% American Indian. I think American Indians tend to be more involved as a subject of an OIS Oh no, I'm sorry, more as a homicide victim, I think. So they're not actually not that. That I guess that was a surprising thing. So American Indians, black individuals, I think we've had one multiracial, are pretty low. If you can, it's almost all Hispanic and white, and then somewhat comparable to homicide victims and offenders. If you want to go to the next one for victims, and that's the slide I was just thinking about. They're pretty similar. So this was you go this way, yeah. So this is a look at officers in the force, and I should have looked at the percentage of the actual sworn officers, but this is those involved in OISs. So what is that? 57%? So this kind of flips. It's 57% white and 39% Hispanic. I think that's reflective of what our force looks like, but it's not as reflective of what the community looks like. And we've seen that in other communities as well. And one of the reasons we're work on diversity and trying to get more Hispanics, blacks, Native Americans hired as officers, Asians.
You know, and one thing that, you know, if you go back 2 slides and you show the ethnicity of the individuals involved in the shooting, you know, I think this is where we will continue to work with our ambassador program. Like, we know that we potentially have strained relationships and that we have to work more with the Hispanic community right now. We do have a relationship with various groups in there. We have to continue to make sure that we have outreach, because like I said, the last thing I want is us to get back to where we were in 2014 and people have unanswered questions and they feel like they are the victims of police violence. So we know this kind of helps us determine, like, where do we have to continue to put resources into? Where do we have to make sure that we're doing as much outreach as possible and working with those various communities? Like, we're going to work with every community, but particularly we know that we have to put some work into this community.
I'm going to go to subject by age. So this is interesting as well. If you look at the subjects of an OIS, most of them are the 26 to 35 year range. And what's interesting is the teenager and 18 to 25 are pretty low, definitely compared to homicides, they're very low. And then you tend to have on older groups that are also the subject of an officer-involved shooting. I think that's one unique thing to officer-involved shootings. I've seen in other areas of the country where, you know, we hear a lot about kind of middle-aged white males tend to be involved in an officer-involved shooting. But this is pretty interesting, I think.
You know, and I think the important thing to realize here is, like, what is being done well here? And, you know, I want to compliment, we have so many studies. We have specialty courts like young adult court and all these other processes that we have working in place. And, you know, I think this is a great example of why, you know, we have a lower number here. We know that this is a bigger at-risk age group. We know that we have had studies that say 18 to 25 is an age group that, you know, people are really at that crossroad where they could make poor decisions, and that the whole goal is to get them to 25. I think we need to look at this as a community and realize, like, you know, maybe we need to expand the time frames of where we're looking at individuals at those crucial ages and start devoting resources to 26 to 35-year-olds to see if we could get this number going down, kind of like we do at the 18 to 25. Because we do have extensive resources, there's studies, everything is saying we put a lot of resources into this age group. We need to kind of shift some of those resources to an older age group.
And I think that 2% down there represents one 15-year-old, right, from earlier this year, if you guys remember, on the west side. So this next slide, this one compares it to homicide offender, and you kind of see that phenomenon I'm talking about. Homicide offenders tend to be 18 to 25-year-olds. And then there's a fair amount of teenagers, 17 and under. And then a fair amount of 26 to 35, but it is a different dynamic than we see with OIS subjects. And the next slide looks at homicide, compares it to homicide. Is it the same thing? This is offenders. Yeah, I just have the wrong, this should be victims, I think. It just has the wrong title. So, pretty similar. And then the other, maybe it's not shocking, but every single subject of an officer-involved shooting has been male. So out of 53, now 54, every single one has been a male. I think, I want to say, I've looked at other cities, and it's kind of mixed. I know I could think of one female subject from before we started, a couple of years, that was, got a lot of publicity. And just looking at homicide. So homicide offenders tends to be predominantly male, but there is 12% female for homicides. And then this, again, should be victim. So victim is, females are a little more likely to be a victim of a homicide than an offender. And then the officer gender as well. 96% male, only 4 female officers have been involved in an officer-involved shooting, and I want to say that was only in 2 different incidents back in 2018 when we first started, but ever since then we haven't had any female officers involved. We're getting close to the end here. I looked at officer experience at the time, just how many years they have on the force. Usually when we have a presentation, we'll say when they started. So 22 are the two biggest ones, had between 2 and 3 years of experience, and then it kind of just runs a gamut for the rest of the time. So there tend to be a lot of young officers.
And I think the thing to remember here is that this large group makes up a large portion of our field services, which are our uniformed officers. They haven't had time to go to specialized unit. They're newer, they're still working in the field. One of the things I want the public to remember is, like, these officers, we feel, in a lot of ways, we feel very comfortable because they've been trained to the new standards under our settlement agreement with the Department of Justice, and they've received some of the most updated advanced training, and I think that's going to reflect through in the slides that we're about to see in terms of misconduct and how we have seen our officer-involved shootings, and how where there has been issues, how even though this larger group, this is a larger group, that it doesn't necessarily reflect the discipline.
So this is a look at the officers with prior officer-involved shooting incidents. As I said at the beginning, 75% had no prior. This was their first officer-involved shooting. 16% had 1 prior, and 9%, which seems to me a pretty small amount, so it's probably like 4 or 5 individuals who had 2 or more prior OISs. And I mean, significantly, I think, and I don't know what it was before our time here, but I remember in the monitors or the DOJ investigation, they really highlighted a lot of individuals who had multiple officer-involved shootings, and it seemed like nothing was done. But maybe Chief wants to talk about what we've done when we see this happen.
One of the things here is we have a great officer wellness program, and we've actually had officers who've been involved in multiple shootings who ask to leave the field or go to another unit. And this 9% is going to be made up primarily of 3 units. And they're the units that deal with the most difficult, dangerous situations. Our tactical section and members from our investigative support unit, ISU, that are out looking for the most violent of offenders, that are going to make up this largest portion, all within the 9%.
So we're going to kind of shift and look at our investigations of officers and the OIS incidents. And just a reminder of how the process works. So we have a criminal investigation that takes place by the multi-agency task force, and I do want to just recognize those detectives and investigators and the crime lab. We were out this morning again, and Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, State Police, APD, and these guys are just top notch. And put a lot of time and effort into these criminal investigations. So they work on that report over several months and forward their report to the district attorney's office, and they decide whether any charges are merited. But at the same time, we also have, and we always say this when we do these presentations, we have administrative investigations. So that's done internally through our force division, our internal affairs, and our Deputy Director, Zach Cottrell, is going to talk a little bit about it. I'll go through the couple slides real quick, but he can tell you how that process works. But he gave me some statistics, but if you look at these, out of all the 53, except for those that haven't been investigated yet, 83% were found to be in policy, 6% were found to be out of policy, which is, I think, 3 incidents, and then 11% are still under investigation.
And I think if we go back, the big thing to remember here is, like, we have a 12% unknown, we have a 6% we know is out of policy. And we have to have realistic standards. Like, we have very high standards under our settlement agreement, and our settlement agreement's goal has always been 95%. 95% of everything we do, we want to be within policy. So if you look, this is very similar to what we're seeing across the board recently, and Deputy Director Cottrell could talk a little bit about that. We just talked about how our use of force policy has shown that we're about 6.5% to 7% of the time that it's not in policy, 93% of the time, and we've raised it to that point. It's very similar with our deadly force that's used in our officer-involved shootings. So in the grand scheme of things, we're looking like we want this 5% or lower. Obviously, we want it 0, but we want this 5% or lower in order to meet the requirements of our settlement agreement. And I think yesterday's settlement DOJ report really highlights the success and how we're moving in the right direction with this.
The other part of that is I think it gets lost when there's during the media attention on these shootings is I think the public may misunderstand and think that every shooting is a deadly force incident and out of policy or an excessive use of force, which isn't the case at all. This is what this looks at, and looks at foreign policy. That means that they follow those standards set by the department, and just the other part of that. So when they do these investigations, and Zach talked about it, they also look at officer misconduct. So if there's allegations of officer misconduct in any fashion, they look at those as well. And I was kind of surprised looking at the whole thing. Anyone involved, so supervisors who are not even involved in the use of force, there might be allegations of misconduct, like not using their OBRD during the investigation or other kind of things going on. So they look at all those sorts of things. So if you go to the next slide, if you look at those officer misconduct, they investigated 15 allegations of misconduct by officers involved in deadly force. So these are just the officers who were involved. They also investigated allegations of misconduct by officers and supervisors who were not involved, which I just explained. And then we have 6 cases still under investigation for misconduct. And then these are just the types of misconduct. So it goes anything from deadly force. We had instances with deadly force in motor vehicles where some of our policy violations occurred. Duty to provide medical attention and transportation, response to behavioral health issues, use of force prohibitions, room clearing fundamentals. There was one instance, I think our very first one in 2018 involved clearing a room and someone had a knife. So I think those officers had to be trained a little more. Using on-body recording devices, obviously, duties of personnel, and reporting for duty. And then this slide looks at the discipline that resulted from the investigations. So we said there were 3 out-of-policy officer-involved shootings. Out of those resulted in 2 terminations of officers, 1 suspension, 5 letters of reprimand, 3 verbal reprimands, and 6 instances of additional training. And then before Zach comes up, I'll just give you the final slide. This is just a look at legal action resulting from officer-involved shootings. Obviously, I think when the DOJ came in, I remember at that time, the city was paying out tens of millions of dollars for a lot of these cases and settlements and judgments. So far, 36 of the 53 cases have resulted in no illegal action. There are 11 pending tort claims, which could result in lawsuits. We have 4 pending lawsuits. We've had 1 settlement so far, and then 1 ruling in the city's favor, but that could be appealed still. So with that, I just want to ask Zach to come up and just talk a little bit more about the administrative side.
Good morning. I'm Deputy Director Zach Cottrell. Like Chief talked about, we also, in addition to the criminal investigation done by the multi-agency task force, we also do an administrative review, which is done within our Internal Affairs Force Division. They review every actual application of force, especially involving officer-involved shootings. It's important to remember that our use of force policy is actually more strict than what federal law requires us to have. So when we are looking at these officer-involved shootings, we're actually comparing them to our very strict use of force policy. As Gilbert was talking about those policy violations that we've come up through investigations done by our Internal Affairs Force Division, those potential policy violations are then referred to our Internal Affairs Division. Within Internal Affairs, they then compare those potential policy violations to policy to see if the officers involved did violate the policy. It's very important to remember that just because there's a policy violation in the use of force, it does not make that use of force out of policy. As Gilbert talked about, it can range from anywhere from not activating their on-body recording device immediately upon getting to a scene, to not uploading when they're supposed to not rendering aid or transporting individuals correctly, handcuffed correctly, stuff like that. So most of those policy violations that we have seen in the last 4 years out of officer-involved shootings have been minor instances. I think the graph that they put up showing the discipline that was given out in relation to officer-involved shootings is mostly minor violations. Most of them have been OBRD when I went back through them. Gilbert talked about the 2 that were terminated. I think that shows that the department is investigating these internally very thoroughly, taking it very seriously, applying our use of force policies the way that we're supposed to, especially considering we're under the Department of Justice consent decree. But it's also important that we also look for trends in these shootings. We take training not only for one individual involved in the shooting, or if we start seeing trends, we incorporate that training department-wide. Every year we're required to do 40 hours of use of force training for every officer on this department. So we take a lot of what we learn from these force investigations, incorporate that into training, so that year to year, hopefully our training is getting better. Our officers are more equipped, better equipped, and arrive on these scenes in a better state of mind. I think Chief talked about the shooting last night. I think that's a perfect example of how we've progressed as a department. 2 officers had their less lethal option ready, and 2 officers had lethal option ready. There was a supervisor on scene running the scene, and that's exactly how our training has evolved over the last few years. So there were options available to those officers so that when they were presented with a deadly threat, they could react appropriately. Obviously, that's still under investigation. We'll do the administrative review of that through force, and any policy violations will be investigated within internal affairs. So I'll have to work. Okay.
And I'm anxiously awaiting the results of last night's officer-involved shooting, because one of the things that we have learned through the processes we have is to identify gaps or problems, whether it's in policy or training. And we did have a shooting at a bus stop of the Eubank a couple years ago that was controversial at the time. An individual had a airsoft gun. Based off of that review, we recognize that we should train our officers more about the 7 critical tasks, make sure that perimeters are being started, supervisors on scene. So we formulated a whole training regimen based off of this information. And, we talked about it in the last officer-involved shooting. There's a lot of concern with our policy on how it's written for passive-aggressive individuals. And we talked about the Tenorio shooting on San Mateo, where, that person was passive-resistant and we were able to deploy less lethal. And based off of that, Deputy Director Cottrell is working to modify that policy so that these individuals who are armed in certain circumstances, the totality of the situation would allow us to use less lethal on some of these individuals that could be considered passive resistant. And I'm waiting to see if last night we would have had the opportunity to utilize less lethal on this individual had he been passive resistant, to see if it truly is a trend and we could have reduced that shooting if our policy could be reeled back a little. So there's a lot to learn. And, in closing, I want to say that, I know families are impacted. They're changed forever. I consistently meet with victims of homicides. Last night I met with and spoke to a group of victims of homicide, and the families become lifelong friends to the department and the people who work with them. So I know the families are impacted. I know it's a big burden on them. I also know that there's great risk, liability to the city and the taxpayers of this city, but also to the integrity and trust that the community has with the Albuquerque Police Department. But I don't want to leave out the fact that this also impacts our officers. I was involved in a shooting early in my career, and I can tell you that it probably only is in the last 4 years that I could discuss that situation without getting emotional about it. And I think that even when I took over as chief, I sat with somebody in this room and we had a conversation about that, and it still bothered me. And I think that we got to remember that our officers also carry this forever. So I'm hoping that we could reflect back at the beginning of this press conference and think about those 3 issues that we spoke about and how we could work with our community and how we could get all the partners to the table. We have to find a better way to deal with individuals who are under a mental health crisis. We just simply can't have them released from jail because they're not competent. We have to release them into resources, and we need to make sure as a community we have those resources. And you know, I don't believe it's the police department's job to put these cases together in front of the courts, but I'm committed to lower officer-involved shootings and lower violence in this community. And if the Albuquerque Police Department has to seek the funding to do this job because there's nobody else who can do it, the community has my commitment that we'll move in that direction. And we actually already started some groundwork on a pilot project where we want to do this, because we simply cannot have our officers trying to we can't count on our officers de-escalating every situation at 2 in the morning with an individual who is already in safety. And I'm asking the advocates out there that have focused so much on the homeless that for a moment, take a step back. Realize that the police department is taking the right steps in the right direction. Work with us and help us advocate for the proper resources for your clients to get the help that they need. Somebody just went dead. It's fixed. Let that turn back on.
Do you mind hitting? There's a on-off button. Oh, there it's on.
Is it on?
Yeah, it's good.
See, that's quick reaction. No, for us to continue to work together to get people the help that they need. This isn't about pointing fingers at one another. This is about working together. How do we make sure that people get the help that they need? Because this process of just releasing people back into the community, and we're not pointing fingers at anybody, the DA's office, the public defenders, the courts. This is about, it's a difficult task and an understanding of who is responsible for these individuals. If we need to bring in the health department, let's bring them in, but we can take a big chunk out of that. And in terms of individuals under the influence, we need stronger penalties, and we need to deter people from going out with their firearms when they're under the influence. So I think there's a lot of things we could do as a community, and I just don't want it lost that these officer-involved shootings and the data and the statistics we talked today do have families that are left behind grieving, do affect our officers, and do have an impact on the community relationships for the Albuquerque Police Department. And that's why we're here today, to be as transparent and talk about this issue and get it out in front of the public so that they have true information and know exactly what we're talking about and where we're trying to present some of this data to the public to be able to know and be educated on the topic. Questions?
Any questions?
Yeah, you mentioned the homeless. I guess what percentage of these are there statistics on how many of these officer-involved shootings involve subjects who are unhoused?
It's a great question, and if we don't have it, we will be trying to figure it out.
It's kind of tough to figure out, but I've noticed a lot this year on homicides, victims and offenders, more so than in the past, and that's one of the things I want to kind of figure out as well.
That's a great idea, and we're going to look into that. Because I really wholeheartedly believe that as our unhoused population has grown, that's kind of reflective to some of our violent crime problems that we're seeing within the city.
And then, of course, you mentioned there were 53 officer-involved shootings as of 2018. How many have been just this year?
This year we are at 17.
Does that include the one last night?
Yes. Yes, Elise.
In the beginning, you talked about like the 3 groups of officer-involved shootings. Can you give us a breakdown of how many are in each group?
I don't have that immediately with me, and some may cross over, but we'll work on getting you those numbers. Because you got to remember, we're going to have some individuals that it's really unknown, and I could think of 2 right off the back. The individual off of Tramway this year with the cell phone. That individual is possibly under the influence of alcohol, but at the same time, we know that he has a mental health history. So we may not be able to just pin it to one of those 3 issues.
It's also difficult, I think. I couldn't figure out a way to determine if there's a mental health issue. It's not shown in a toxicology report, or in some cases maybe it was known during the investigation, but that's a really difficult one.
And it's very subjective, because we're going to have to just look at their actions and say it's obvious. Like the individual, Second Essential, who drove up to the officers, and in our opinion, it was a suicide by cop where he pulled out the gun and had been driving around. So there is, it's very difficult to pin an exact, but I think we could try to find something to that extent.
I guess what I'm getting at is the difference between someone like the man that you just mentioned on Tramway and somebody who, like Kashawn Thomas, who and possibly the one over the weekend. I talked to some family members, like someone who's just kind of drunk in their car, they pick up a gun, and then they get killed. That's very different from someone who was pointing a cell phone, was saying that they were going to shoot people. So,
See, and
break out those categories?
I think those are two very distinct categories that we're trying to explain. And those are two perfect cases. Like, to me, those are two individual cases where alcohol was definitely a factor and there were some decisions made by individuals that was costly. And we're actually planning a media campaign on this. Like, we have to educate the community. Like, I see no good coming from an individual who is intoxicated and picks up a firearm in the presence of an officer without communication. It's going to be very difficult because things are going to occur so fast and decisions are going to have to be made. And one of the things I talked about is Gilbert is like, we have to educate the community. The community has to understand that if you do have a firearm in your car, we just need you to tell the officer. We don't want you to try to recover it and hand it to the officer. But at the same time, there has to be strong communication, but there still is that concern. When somebody's in that state of mind, are they going to be able to comprehend and make that right decision? And that's something that we're going to have to struggle with, and that's why I think increasing penalties along with the community education is key, because we have to make it, we have to have some kind of deterrence. Leave your gun at home, don't take it with you if you plan to go out and drink.
It's legal to have a gun in your car. It's legal
Yes.
to drink. People are always going to drink, it seems like.
Yes.
What about like education from the officer side? Like, how much of a threat is someone who's, very drunk and just picks up a gun?
You know, I'll propose this question back to the media. Would anybody like me to give a firearm to a drunk person and have you stand in front of them and make the decision that you're not going to do
Yeah, but
anything
we haven't
about it?
done any of the training.
But see, but at least we have to remember there is no training, and we'll ask Zach to jump in here with policy questions. But is there realistically a training where we could train officers to know and understand what somebody who is intoxicated thought process is? I think if we could develop that training, if anybody could give us a national model or a program that has that type of training, we're more than open and we will adopt it immediately once we get it through the DOJ process. But there is no training that says you can predict somebody's behavior who is under the influence of alcohol and officers, and it gives them time. I think that's a situation where we have to let the cases take its course through Force Review Board, and we have to determine, is there policy or training outside of trying to predict that person's behavior that we could modify to reduce the likelihood of us having to use deadly force. And I've said this before with the DOJ process. The DOJ process missed one huge aspect in all this. Everybody missed it, and I've been very critical about this. They missed the process of complete disengagement. And there are times when maybe there is a disengagement that needs to occur. They wrote in very well, de-escalation. And this is why I think it's important that these processes have individuals who are currently involved with law enforcement and seeing the trends that are occurring, because this is something we need to figure out still as a department. When are we going to disengage? But we're not at that point right now. And we're working so hard on other aspects of de-escalation and training, and I'm hoping that we could eventually in the near future have the time carved out to be able to advance our training and be one of the first departments that have that disengagement and that we're able to utilize that training for situations like that.
Disengagement, like you go to a scene and you decide you can just...
Then you decide that you either retreat, or that in some circumstances you retreat, or in some circumstances the individual is let go. I mean, we have it in one aspect. Think of 2009 to 14 and all the officer-involved shootings with suicidal barricaded subjects. What do we do with those subjects now? We don't have those shootings. Why? We disengage and we get away. But it's only covered in that one process. And maybe we have to look at it as a bigger process.
And with over 50% of the subjects involved in the officer-involved shootings, you mentioned being Hispanic men, I guess, how's the department going to work to kind of reduce that? Or you mentioned kind of working with the Hispanic community.
You know, I think that's where having the foundations of an ambassador program is so important, and us being able to reach out and start educating that portion of the community. And this community education that me and Gilbert have been talking about that we want to push out, that's where we're going to utilize the ambassador program to start getting the word out to different communities and different groups and say, look, you know, culturally, if this is a cultural issue, we got to stop doing this. I'll be honest, I'm a Hispanic male. I grew up in a small town, and there was nowhere I went growing up that you didn't have a hunting rifle with you. I grew up hunting and fishing. And, you know, sometimes maybe we need to remind people that there are circumstances where you shouldn't be going out if you're going to be conducting certain activities, or if you decide to start drinking, what are some appropriate options people could think about to safeguard themselves and secure the weapon in the trunk, separate it from its ammunition, take it out of the front of the car or council beforehand and put it somewhere else. So I think there's a lot of things that we still need to discuss. And I just want to be really open, and I also want to really invite the community and the media. Like, Elise had a great question, like, what can our officers have done differently? And we're saying that there is no training for that. If somebody knows of a training or something that another agency is doing to deal with any of these specific situations that could have reduced the likelihood of a deadly force encounter, we are all ears and wanting to work with the Albuquerque Police Department. And I know that this is a great room for resources, and each one of you will go back and, you know, you will do the Google searches and see what other agencies are doing. If there's an idea that we need to implement at the Albuquerque Police Department, that's part of who we want to become and the culture we want to have here. We want to listen and work with the community. So get us that information, and maybe together as a group with the media, we could find an answer to something that we're trying to solve, or an issue that we're trying to solve in the community, and how we're policing the city of Albuquerque.
Chief, is 17 the most OASs you guys have had in a year?
Yes, 17 is higher than even pre-DOJ numbers.
Why do you think there's that increase? I mean, you go from 10, 8, 10, 9 to now 17, and we're not done with the year. Any idea why there's an increase of that?
I think it's related to where we are as a country and where we are as a society right now coming out of the pandemic. I would love for somebody to do a study to show the impacts on the pandemic and how it's affecting society now. If you look at how it's affected, there's been numerous studies about the increase in suicides. Nationwide, we're seeing an increase in homicides. And we know that a lot of times it's either one or the other. You're either going to react externally through a homicide or a possible officer-involved shooting, or you're going to react internally through suicide or suicide by cops. So I think that given that those two categories are seeing increases nationwide, and that we're seeing it at a level never before, I think that's directly attributing to the increase in officer-involved shootings. And you have to also look, there are more firearms sold during the pandemic than probably any other period of time within this country. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but I'm saying that we have individuals who may not have been responsible and didn't have a firearm before, that now felt that during that time frame they wanted to be armed, and they just maybe don't understand some of the things that potentially could go wrong with that. And that's why this aspect of community education is so important for us.
And you said these OASs come from 3 main units in your department, correct? Tactical, and what were the other 2 that you named?
No, I said that the ones involved in multiple OISs come basically from 2 main units, and those ones with multiple shootings, the officers, it's going to come from our tactical section and our investigative services unit.
But for the most part, it's been officers, patrol officers.
Yeah, patrol officers by far involved in the most officer-involved shootings.
Yes, I noticed up there statistics when it said APD workforce, there wasn't a category for Black African American. I noticed the homicide rate they were measuring, and then victims and perpetrators. Is there any explanation or logic why there wasn't Black African American on there?
There is no explanation or logic to it. One of the things we want to do, and that we actually just started in the last 2 weeks, is we're trying to start a mentorship program with the Black community to increase the membership of the Black community within the Albuquerque Police Department. We are working with local leaders from the Black community and with the Office of Equity and Inclusion, and our goal is to pair a mentor with an applicant and hope that that mentor can help get that applicant through the process. We're not even trying to look at when they're already in the system. We want to offer a mentor as they start going into the application process to hopefully walk and increase our membership within the police department.
And that graph was no African American officers involved in an officer-involved shooting. I could get you the percentages.
Yeah, we could get you the percentage on the other.
It's not very high, but it.
Any other questions? Yes, Louise.
So with the toxicology reports, is that anyone who had anything in their system, or like that they were high at the time or drunk at the time that the shooting happened? Like, are you differentiating between someone who has used meth 2 days earlier and still has it in their system, or someone who's using that at the time?
I think it's just if they had it at the time.
So
of
that's
the
not
autopsy.
necessarily people who are actively using when they were shot.
I don't think that could be
No, it's
known.
just what was in the system.
I think alcohol would be a good one to say it was actively in their system because it only stays in the system a certain period of time. There are some drugs that are in the system shorter periods of time than other. When I saw the ones that indicated that they were on marijuana, I was like, yeah, that could be like 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever the time frame is. So I think you'd have to look at the drug categories individually and see how long that the drug is in their system and could be detected by a toxicology.
And then my last question is about the out-of-policy shootings. There was a period of time where their investigations were not very good. That was heavily criticized a couple of years ago by the Monitor. So do you trust that those were the only ones that are out of policy? Have they been looked at by the Force Review Board and by other people? Can we trust that?
I'm going to let Zach hit this one because he knows that way better than me.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't forget that we still have the External Force Investigation Team here on site reviewing every investigation that comes out of our Internal Affairs Force Division.
But that's a recent thing.
That's the last 2 years.
Yeah, but have they looked at the ones between 2018?
They have not. We're going through those now in the backlog. They're actually doing those investigations for us. They started with the officer-involved shootings first. They're going through those first. Then they're going to look at high-incident officers next. So they're going through those officer-involved shootings now. Also, the independent monitoring team looks at every force investigation done on an officer-involved shooting, to include the misconduct that comes out of internal affairs. When we get data requests from the monitor, that's the first thing they ask for, any out-of-policy use of force and a subsequent misconduct investigation out of it. So that's getting reviewed by them. And we were criticized for our internal affairs investigations, up to 2018. If you read the monitor's report that came out yesterday, everything with internal affairs is within compliance. They trust our investigations now. They've said they're complete, thorough, and that our findings are adequate. So I think we can trust our findings. I will say that there still are a few OISs that are in that backlog that were 467 cases, something like that, that did not get investigated, that we did contract out to another external force investigation team to come and do those investigations now. They are going through those first. We'll have better data on those probably in the next few months from them. Their quarterly report's going to come out in about a month that we'll have to file with the court under the Department of Justice consent decree. But as those backlog investigations get done, it's possible we'll see a couple more out of policy in those cases as well.
That's a good question.
And I just wanted to introduce to Mr. Valdez, our new superintendent, police reform, is here with us, in case you haven't met him before, but just wanted to introduce him. Any other questions? Okay.
I do have a question, but it's not related to this. Do you guys by any chance have any information on the ATM burglary that happened over at La Montañita Food Market over on the southeast side?
No, but we will have somebody track that one down.
Oh,
Hang out a second afterwards and we'll get the right. We'll
okay.
figure out contact and we'll get back to you.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? So I thank everybody for being here today. I think it was a great, I like the questions, the discussions. I've always said it. I like questions. It helps us clarify things that we may not be thinking of. So thank you. And if anybody comes across ideas, this is about us working together as a community to find answers. And if we're missing something, we're more than open to taking a look at it and seeing how we can move forward.
And we're going to be posting I'll send this presentation around, but we're also going to be posting it on the website and then kind of updating as we go along, same with homicides and non-fatal shootings. So the public, can have access to this. If anyone else sees any trends or has questions, we just want to put it out there and, for everyone to look at. Okay. Thank you, everybody.